Millennium Water Alliance. We're glad. I'm just going to kick off with a few opening remarks. And, why is the NWA community working on carbon credits and carbon finance? And, the WASH sector has made a lot of progress in recent years, but we must urgently keep pushing to find new models, partnerships, new ways of working to serve people better and permanently. So that's one of the reasons we're looking into this space. In the context of this urgency are threats to overall resources in the face of rising demand and the very real risk of climate change. So more specifically, what we've seen as the alliance is that a critical gap to sustaining water services is cash flow, performance incentives, operations and maintenance over many years. And we need to be thinking more in terms of decades, not just years. And we have opportunities to engage new skills, new partners, and think more broadly about how we partner across the sector to deliver better solutions. And we believe climate finance can be an important tool to do that. We also believe that carbon credits have the potential to incentivize uptime and finance uptime. But as we'll get into today, it's not easy, it's not cheap, and it's not always viable. So knowing how and when and where to dig into this, when to make that investment is important. We won't be able to answer all your questions today, but we want to get into the practicalities of when and where this resource can make sense. So we have some great presentations coming up, some excellent panelists from the membership and allies who can share their experiences and some of the tools they're learning. So we're glad you're here, both online and in person, and let's get into it. Dr. Evan Thomas from the University of Colorado's Mortensen Center for Global Engineering, and I will mention that Verity, part of or an offshoot of UC Boulder, is a project developer with NWA in our work in Kenya. So getting into the weeds on some of this together, it's been fun. Let's use that word, and we're going to learn more.
Thanks, Keith. Hi, everybody. And everybody online, can they hear us okay? Jason? Okay, great. Thanks for coming today, and thanks everybody online. We're going to be presenting 2 reports today, talking about the intersection of water security, inclusive of WASH, and climate finance, in particular the voluntary carbon market. The first report that I'll be presenting is entitled Decarbonizing Water, Applying the Voluntary Carbon Market Towards Global Water Security. This was sponsored by some of the major names in both water and voluntary carbon markets, including WaterAid, HSBC, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, and the Gold Standard, which is actually the registry that produces the methodology we can use as WASH practitioners. It was written by our team at the University of Colorado and Castilia Advisors. 2 of my co-authors are here, David Earhart with Castilia and Christina Barstow with the University of Colorado. For those of you in the room, we have hard copies in the back. And for those of you online, there's a QR code that you can scan, which I think will work. It's the first time I did that. Today, we're going to review the global water security context and the global emissions context, the intersection between water and climate change, the status of the voluntary carbon markets. Most of you here are going to be WASH and water people, but I'm sure you've heard nasty things about carbon credits and the voluntary carbon market, either within the WASH world or through articles in The Guardian. So we're going to update you on where we stand with what are carbon credits and whether or not you can be a cheerleader for them. We're going to talk about the typology of existing as well as potential water-based voluntary carbon credit market program. So there are a lot of water projects out there, but there's actually a lot more potential in water that isn't covered by existing programs or existing methodologies. Then I'll review where there are programs and their scale and their locations, and then existing project types. We also interviewed about 24 stakeholders in this space. Christina led those interviews. And so we have some insights that go beyond our interpretation, but in fact, include a lot of insights, some of you in this room, and more broadly. Okay, so a bit of context. The water sector broadly produces 10% of global emissions, 10% involved in handling of water and wastewater, or lack of handling of water and wastewater. So untreated sludge in some cases. Just the water sector, actual active water management, is 4% of global emissions. So that's the water industry is 4% of global emissions. By contrast, the airlines are 2% of global emissions, and maritime is 2% of global emissions. So you probably think about airplanes and freight when you think about climate change, But in fact, add those together, it's still about the same size as active water management and less than half of the water sector overall. And yet still, even though we're producing all those emissions, about 4 billion people face water insecurity globally. In the WASH world, we talk about I know the numbers shift on us a little bit, but roughly billion people that don't have safely managed water every day. There are really closer to 4 billion people that have some water insecurity, plus another billion people are expected to be displaced because of water insecurity by 2030. So we're talking about 5 billion people. Most of the people on the planet are facing water insecurity either now or in the near future because of climate change. I'm going to start with a bit of an introduction into carbon credits. Sorry, the screen's a little bit slow here. Who's heard of carbon credits before? Who's heard nasty things about carbon credits before? Okay, who believes these nasty things about carbon credits? Okay, great. Oh, great. My co-authors. Yeah, that's right. So the voluntary carbon market is voluntary. The buyer, there's a compliance market in the European Union. It's much, much bigger. It's billions and billions and billions of dollars. But projects have to be based within the European Union and are complying with European Union regulations. The voluntary carbon market is different. It's only about $2 billion a year. If you read that New Yorker article about it recently, it's smaller than the razor blade industry. So it gets a lot of attention for a pretty small market. And it's voluntary. It's corporations, American and European corporations mostly, who are offsetting what is either called their scope 1 or scope 2, or now more often their scope 3 emissions, their value chain emissions that they're unable to abate through direct action within their carbon footprint. They don't have to do this. They do it because they want to. They do it because it looks good to their shareholders and to their customers, and it provides social license to operate. The companies that are participating in the voluntary carbon market, you might have heard this idea that it's an excuse to emit. In fact, again, it's voluntary. The companies that are choosing to buy carbon credits are decarbonizing twice as fast as their industry peers. So it's not an either or, it's a decarbonize and try to mitigate or offset the balance. The criticism that's existed in the voluntary carbon market, basically since this was born, right? This thing came out of the Montreal Protocol, which was the acid rain trading back in the 80s, 70s, and it worked. We actually fixed the ozone layer. When I talk to my students, they never heard of the ozone layer. Who remembers the whole ozone layer? Right, we remember, nobody else does. It was born, after 2000. Permitting for ozone permits worked. And so cap and trade or carbon credits was, let's do this for all of CO2 or all of CO2 equivalent. It hasn't worked that well. It's hard to measure. It's hard to have that equivalence. It's hard to have the monitoring and measurement in the same way as we had with CHCs, which are much more centralized production, industrial production. And as a result, there's been good projects and there's been bad projects. And there's expensive projects and there's cheap projects. And they happen all over the world. The Core Carbon Principles is an initiative that basically came online in the past year in response to some of this criticism to try to curate and self-manage the highest quality projects and methodologies so that corporations, buyers, can have confidence that they weren't going to get a whole lot of bad press or get sued for buying certain carbon credits. So there are 3 major categories. A project has to be additional. You can only get carbon credits for a project that would not have otherwise already happened. Although additionality doesn't just mean financial additionality. That's typically how it's interpreted, but it's not the only definition or interpretation of additionality. The emissions reductions or avoidances must be permanent. They can't, you can't have a backslide where you've sold that carbon credit and then in fact, those emissions happened anyway. There needs to be robust quantification in the standards and the monitoring and no double counting. And double counting is a tricky issue right now. I'll get back to it in a few minutes, where there are both nationally declared contributions that every country in the world has committed to, where on a country level, you're trying to reduce your emissions and demonstrate that compliance. But at the same time, you might have the private sector doing carbon projects within your country, whether it's the United States or in Kenya. And there's challenges right now, it's not fully resolved, in how to make sure that you can have a private sector participation via carbon credits, but also meet NDCs and not count them at the same, not double count them. And certain standards around governance, and then of course sustainable development. So focusing on contributions to communities where the actual work is happening, and contributions to a transition towards net zero. This is a summary from Bloomberg just last week of their forecast of the demand and supply and pricing for carbon credits. This is pretty conservative. Bloomberg suggests that, given the challenges in the past couple of years around criticism and quality in the market, if the voluntary carbon market can get together and maintain a high quality standard, the prices will rise to about $20 by 2030. 2 years ago, they were at $50. So this market's all over the place. Other projections put it at $100 by 2030. More bullish projections suggest we'll be at $100 a ton by 2030. But you can also see that Bloomberg does observe that prices per ton might go above $200 by 2040 or 2045. That's a long time from now. We're focused more on the 2030 timeline. The other observation is that demand for credits is much higher than supply. In fact, retirements were at an all-time high in 2030. The rate of growth decreased, but the market did not actually backslide. It actually continued to increase. Issuances and retirements were at an all-time high in 2023 and are expected to continue to grow in 2024. All right, so let's come back in terms of how does the voluntary carbon market relate to water? This is a typography that we produce in our report where we are generating water security carbon credits, both through removals, which are things primarily sequestration. So that's coastal mangroves and terrestrial wetlands, both of which actually serve to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. These are generally fetching a much higher price in the market. The demand today for removals is much, much higher than the demand for what are called avoidance credits, where you might avoid an emission. We have Bill Gates to thank for that. Bill Gates said trees aren't going to solve our problem, only direct air capture is going to solve our problem, and that shifted the market. Probably will rebalance in the next couple of months or the next couple of years. Within emission reductions or avoidances, there are water-related programs or opportunities in agriculture, especially around rice cultivation and the grid energy transition for irrigation. There are opportunities in both medium and high-income countries around domestic and industrial wastewater treatment, both in terms of energy transition as well as methane reduction. And then in medium and low-income settings around latrine value chain upgrades and provisioning of clean drinking water services. And we'll talk specifically about that in a bit more detail here, since most of you are in the WASH world. This is a projection of our estimate of the total number of carbon credits that could be generated annually from the water sector. About 1.6 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, 1.6 billion tons of 1.6 billion carbon credits, with rice cultivation dominating the opportunity, reduced grid emissions, which is where Castilia spent a lot of time providing analysis for our report, both industrial and domestic wastewater management upgrades, and then in the WASH sector, still a significant opportunity in using the gold standard methodology to provide clean drinking water services. And then on a lower emphasis, watershed nutrient reduction, so watershed upgrades or watershed restoration, irrigation upgrades, and domestic water management. At an average price of $10, this could be as much as $160 billion invested by the private sector, corporations in global water security. Now, the market is only $2 billion today, and that's the entire market. So there is a great potential, but that hasn't been matched by either demand or supply yet. Within existing programs that already generate carbon credits, there have been 45 million credits issued since 2010 under the two major registries, the gold standard and Verra, which both of which have water-related methodologies available to you. Under the gold standard, there's a methodology for provisioning of clean drinking water and avoidance of biomass and fossil fuels, which is the one that we use in the WASH world. So the breakdown is dominated by the WASH community using the gold standard methodology. That's the vast majority, or that's the largest plurality of credits, followed by wastewater in agriculture and wastewater in industrial setting, and then rice cultivation. This is the same information, but just year by year, starting in 2010. And what's important to observe here is pretty flat growth for the first 10 years that these methodologies were available. And then just in the past few years, a much bigger spikes in issuances and supply dominated again by drinking water. And that little tail that you see in 2023 is because we only had data through October. So in fact, 2023 is probably an all-time high of issuances in this sector. Okay. The methodology that we can use as the WASH community exists under the gold standard. I've personally been involved in this sector for a long time. I helped write this methodology originally back in 2007. There was methodology available under both the gold standard and the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, which is now deprecated. We were the first to bring that to market. We wrote the methodologies and we demonstrated these projects for the first time in both Kenya and Rwanda. And it's based on the premise that, of course, as we all know, billions of people don't have access to clean drinking water. Some small fraction of people, perhaps about 20% in a recent survey, boil their water. So they can pasteurize their water with fossil fuels or wood. The vast majority, 80% or more globally, don't do anything at all. They drink untreated water. The methodology allows for something that is called suppressed demand. Who remembers this term from major controversies in WASH like 10 years ago? I sure do. Okay. Suppressed demand is a premise that's created by the United Nations and the gold standard to observe and recognize that the vast majority of people in low-income settings aren't using any energy at all in the first place. There is no energy transition. There's energy poverty. There's a lack of energy access and the consequences, both health and economic, that are associated with a lack of energy. The other political context for suppressed demand was that most credits were being issued by China and India to basically get paid to not build the dirtiest possible coal power plants and build slightly less dirty coal power plants and get paid by the European Union buyers. So there was a big inequity and a abuse of the carbon markets about 10, 15 years ago. So the UN came up with this concept that tried to recognize that energy poverty was a barrier to productivity and to access to basic services, including water. As such, the methodology allows project developers to provide clean drinking water services, chlorination, supply, filtration, et cetera, borehole repair, as long as the water is clean. You are obligated to test if the water is clean at the point of consumption, as well as at the point of collection, as well as the point of use. And if you do that, your carbon credits can be calculated based on assuming that all that water otherwise would have been boiled. Even if, in fact... Okay, sorry, everybody, we had a bit of a technical difficulty there, but I'm going to keep going. Hopefully people online can hear me. So suppressed demand is it's a legal fiction. It was created on purpose to encourage the voluntary carbon markets to exist in low and middle income settings. It got confused in the early days of using these original methodologies, and there's quite a bit of criticism, mostly from the WASH community, that these weren't real carbon credits. That has really petered off. In our stakeholder interviews, we asked everybody about suppressed demand, and it's not really an issue that is sparking much controversy anymore. The VCM and the broader UNFCCC agreements have recognized the question of reparations and climate repairs and payments to low and middle income countries for the damages of climate change. And so suppressed demand is now viewed as just one mechanism of acknowledging that high income countries need to pay for the damages in low income countries. And we've moved on from fighting over the technicality of suppressed demand. I'm going to share a couple projects that we are actively engaged in with the Millennium Water Alliance and other partners. One is in Rwanda, which is the country that had the first ever UN CDM project that we ran back in 2008, 2009. And the other is in Kenya, which is a partnership that we have with Millennium Water Alliance. In Rwanda, the program is called the Mazi Meza. It's providing school-based water filtration to about 500 schools and about 500,000 students over the next couple of years, offsetting that need and that demand and that use of biomass fuels and kerosene to boil water. This is a country where diarrhea is still the leading cause of illness and death among school-age children. It's no longer the leading cause of morbidity and mortality among under fives. That's air quality or respiratory disease. But among school-age children, diarrhea is still the leading cause of illness and death. It's a gap in services in Rwanda. Rwanda is also a country that issued the first ever what are called Article 6 letters that try to avoid that double counting issue. where the Rwandan government gave a cook stove program just last year, right ahead of COP28, a letter saying your cook stove program can generate carbon credits. You effectively can export those carbon credits and sell them, and we will not double count that those credits towards our nationally declared contribution, which allows the private sector to engage at the same time that there's other energy transition happening in Rwanda. The other project's a program that we've been running with Millennium Water Alliance for a while now, I think actually close to 10 years. It's called the Drought Resilience Impact Platform. It's based on trying to address water security in northern Kenya, where they're now in, Dennis, what is it, the 7th or 8th consecutive season of drought, massive displacement of people, death of livestock, political and social instability, and insecurity. The program, which was originally called Kenya Rapid and was funded by USAID and SDC, evolved into a number of other adjacent funding sub-programs, including work that we've had with NASA to use to forecast the demand for groundwater, work that we've had with USAID to instrument pumps to identify when pumps are broken so they can get repaired. And for the first time ever, USAID has endorsed carbon credits through BHA, Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and provided grant funding to the Millennium Water Alliance to pay for the capital expenses of water point repair. This is actually a huge advance. USAID is explicitly endorsing carbon credits to pay for OPEX and that their grant capital can pay for CapEx. It's essentially a public-private partnership where industry will come in, pay for the operating costs through the purchase of carbon credits on a accountable and performance basis, but USAID recognizes that grant money can pay for those initial capital investments. All right, so that's the WASH world. The rest I'm going to go through a little bit more quickly to get our timing back on track. As you saw in the beginning of the presentation, the single biggest opportunity is actually in rice cultivation. Does any of your organizations work in rice in India in particular? So rice cultivation is 10% of global methane emissions. And methane has a global warming potential of between 20 times and 100 times that of CO2. So 1 ton of methane is 20 to 100 tons of CO2 equivalent. And rice uses about 30 to 40% of our global freshwater, especially in India, in a place where there is less and less water now. Irrigation upgrades can maintain yields while reducing freshwater use and reducing that anaerobic digestion that produces methane. So there's a huge opportunity of about 400 million tons of CO2 equivalent just to get people to move off of flood irrigation to drip irrigation. And one of the largest irrigation companies in the world, Netafim, is focusing on using carbon credits to essentially fund the distribution of their drip irrigation technology. They can't sell the hardware, there's no increase in yields, especially for smallholders or poor farmers. They're not going to buy the equipment, but if carbon credits can let Netafim freely distribute and maintain the irrigation upgrades, then that's a business for them, as well as both methane and freshwater use reductions. Irrigation upgrades broadly don't necessarily mean saving water. Outside of rice, when we look at the rest of irrigated ag in the world, irrigation upgrades tend to use water more efficiently, but not necessarily less of it. I live in Boulder, Colorado. It's a huge problem for us on the Colorado River. The more efficient you get in your use of water, there's actually less water because it's no longer running off back into the river for other people to use. When we get more efficient, it doesn't mean less water, and it doesn't necessarily mean less energy either. So the big opportunity mostly devolves back to the energy transition broadly, the grid energy transition, grid energy mix, to find some emission savings. And then centralized, both domestic and industrial wastewater treatment and management is a huge opportunity. Wastewater is 5% of global methane emissions and about 4% of global energy use and global energy emissions. So 5%, that's the methane that's just off-gassing from not incomplete management of waste. And then the energy emissions is from the electricity used to manage that wastewater, both in industrial and domestic settings. This is work that Castilia is specifically focused on, but transition to renewables and on-site generation of electricity can reduce about 340 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Upgrading domestic systems could avoid about 3 million tons of CO2 a year. Industrial wastewater can avoid 255 million tons a year. And then improved latrine management or reduction of open defecation, so the wash world again, is about 100 million tons a year opportunity. And one that is not, as far as we could tell through our survey, is really not being exploited. You know, the more sanitation focused NGOs in the wash community have not yet really focused on this opportunity to generate carbon credits. Blue carbon is coastal mangroves. I didn't know this before we started this report, but mangroves sequester like 10 times the carbon of the Amazon, of a terrestrial rainforest. You guys know that? Anybody already know that? Okay, some people did that. Okay. Conserving and restoring existing coastal mangroves could save about 1.2 billion tons of CO2 a year. And a recent report identifies or suggests that about 20% of that opportunity is financially viable just on carbon credits alone. So just using carbon credits at current market prices could pay to restore or preserve about 20% of mangroves. Watershed restoration. This is a little bit of a niche, but it's an interesting opportunity in the United States. In the United States, we regulate what are called point source dischargers. So that's wastewater treatment plants, mines, industry, drinking water plants that discharge into America's rivers or America's oceans. We do not regulate what's called non-point source dischargers, essentially agriculture, or other things that can impair water quality, like wildfires. We can't regulate a wildfire, but we certainly invest a lot of money in trying to mitigate the impacts of wildfires. Under the EPA Clean Water Act, there's an opportunity to trade management of point source dischargers, so forcing them to do things like reverse osmosis or tertiary treatment or cooling towers for temperature. This is equipment that is very expensive, very energy intensive, and very emissions intensive, and substitute it for watershed restoration activities. There's a paper coming out in just a few weeks in Nature Communications on this. The estimate is that about 34 million tons of CO2 can be avoided every year, avoided and sequestered every year, if we focus on restoring watersheds instead of building more gray infrastructure in the United States. All right, and then I'm going to briefly review what we learned from some of our stakeholders. As I mentioned, we talked to about 24 experts, both in water and also specifically in WASH, as well as in the voluntary carbon markets, project implementers, project developers, investors, buyers, methodology experts. And we asked, what are the opportunities at the intersection of water and the voluntary carbon markets? Water security credits might fetch a higher price, but mostly in bilateral relations with buyers, which can limit the scale. The big opportunity of bringing carbon credits into water is that it takes these hyper-local problems. Each of you have different projects in different places and can pool that risk and pool the opportunity. With a big enough market at a high enough price, we can all just be putting our credits into an open market. But the market's not that big, and prices change based on perceptions of the credits and the projects and the locations, which ends up meaning that as a project developer, if you want a higher price than the market price, you've got to find that buyer. There are existing gaps in verification that lead to quality questions and durability questions for new and complex project types in the water sector. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a lack of clarification about the interplay between Article 6 and the voluntary carbon markets. This was something that was hoped to have been addressed in Dubai at COP28 and was not. So we basically have another year of trying to figure out how Article 6 relates. There's been only one Article 6 letter issued, as I mentioned earlier, by Rwanda under the gold standard. It's the only one that exists, maybe under Vera, but in Rwanda. Most countries don't have a mechanism yet for even figuring out how to issue these letters. And then, most importantly, the WASH community, the water community and the WASH community know very little about carbon credits, and the carbon credit community know very little about water, which is odd because water is 10% of global emissions. So we all have an opportunity to use things like these reports and these events to improve that articulation and that relationship between water and climate change. There are a number of case studies. I'm not going to review these, but we presented a number of case studies in our report across these different project types. And of course, the report's available to you. And then I'm just going to close on a couple discussion topics that maybe we can also bring up with our panel in a few minutes. One of the biggest opportunities is the energy transition, and David, who's here with us from Castilla, particularly focused on this question. Water addresses multiple SDGs, not just SDG 6 and SDG 8, but multiple SDGs. We already know that. We talk about it all the time in the WASH community. There are questions about regulation, governance, and additionality. Additionality is a really tricky problem in water because often the cheaper thing is the better thing. It's just not done. Watershed restoration is far cheaper than building infrastructure. It's just not done. There are many examples in the water sector where regulatory barriers or regulatory inertia or government priorities are a barrier to projects that actually are cheaper than the baseline or the status quo. In WASH, the water methodology that we use under the gold standard, that the WASH community can use under the gold standard, water treatment is considered automatically additional. Each of these projects do not have to demonstrate any kind of financial additionality because it's just an obvious gap. There are billions of people that have access to clean water. There's obviously a financial gap. So every additional dollar is additional, even if it's coming from carbon credits. So we do not have to demonstrate additionality at all under the gold standard methodology. Another major barrier, and we're going to talk about this, I'm sure Water Mission will talk about this a bit too when we get to the panel. These kinds of credits cost a lot more than the cheapest credits. You know, in a pure market environment, you try to produce your product at the lowest cost and sell it at the market price. It doesn't work in the voluntary carbon market. The cheapest credits are things like burning methane from swine or from mines. They're incredibly cheap to generate. You can generate a lot of carbon credits, and they do really represent an avoided emission. Water projects, especially WASH projects, will cost a lot more per credit, on the order of 10, 20, 30, maybe even $40 per credit, which might be today more than you can get on the market. And of course, credit demand. A true market will have a homogenized price. If that price is $100, everybody's happy. If that price is $10, a lot of projects can't happen. So there has to be more demand at higher prices for credits to generate generate the action that is potential here. Already described suppressed demand. Benefit sharing. This is another really sticky issue in the voluntary carbon market right now. The vast majority of the voluntary carbon market are what are called REDD+ projects. They're forestry projects that are protecting existing forests. People live in these forests or near these forests. And a lot of other people have made a lot of money from doing not that costly things to protect these forests. In some cases, the worst projects that are getting the most attention are these projects that don't cost a lot of money, but end up displacing or otherwise reducing resources for local communities. So in response to that, there's been a lot of discussion of what's called benefit sharing, where some fraction of the revenue of carbon credits as either a tax or a fee or a contract has to go back to the local community. Kenya is considering a tax, an explicit tax, that would essentially represent that and be returned to the local community, this regardless of project type. The problem is that water is a service to communities. All of that money is already being spent by these organizations to provide a water service. It's not extractive, it's proactive, it's providing a service. And it often costs more than you can get on carbon credits anyway. So taxing these projects, in addition to the service that's provided, and given that there's a funding gap usually, probably ends up leading a lot of people to not pursue these programs. So one of the findings in our report is that there needs to be some nuance around interpretation of benefit sharing if the mechanism, if the project that is generating the credit is already a service to a community. And then technologies. There's been a big push in the voluntary markets broadly to have better what are called DMRV, digital monitoring, reporting, and verification technologies. These could be anything from sensors, but are more often remote sensing. And again, that's a big response, not only to where technology is taking us generally, but also to the limitations that have existed in the VCM around monitoring tree stands and monitoring forests and how variable those interpretations have been. So increased emphasis that is rewarded with better pricing on technology monitoring. All right. Thank you. So I just want to remind everybody, the report's in front of you. It's also available online. It was sponsored by VCMI, the Gold Standard, HSBC, WaterAid, and the Resilient Water Accelerator. And then we also had support from Autodesk, the Walton Family Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the U.S. National Science Foundation, and it was written by Castelia and the Mortensen Center at the University of Colorado. Thank you for your time.
Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk about carbon financing for safe water based on a Ethiopia feasibility study and learning paper, which is set to be published this week. We will be sharing both this presentation and links to the feasibility study and the learning paper and Evan's study as well to all of you in this room and also online. So I'll be taking you through the carbon process, the life cycle, I guess you could say. First, I'll start by setting the stage. We'll go over that briefly. A lot of that was covered by Evan, but we'll keep it in the slides for you all's reference. We'll talk about the path of our feasibility study, building down foundation. So we'll go over a go, no-go decision tree, help people make decisions on if and how they want to do apply carbon credits to their WASH projects. The process for certification, few reflections, next steps, and we'll end with a Q&A for both Evan and I's presentation. So let's start with setting the stage. So we'll start by exploring the integration of carbon credits into WASH programs. The project focus was on 10 sites for a windrock project in Amhara, Ethiopia. Aiming for sustainable development through carbon credits, and we hope to take you through the carbon credit process. Key takeaways will be for the potential for carbon to fund and sustain WASH initiatives, navigating regulations, challenges, and overall lessons learned. I'll go ahead and skip this overview a bit. We had a good discussion with Evan. Same thing goes for WASH and carbon credits. One note I'll say is there are a lot of, in addition to safe water, there are a lot of opportunities for carbon mitigation in the sanitation sector. However, they're not necessarily methodologies out there that are taking advantage of it. But there's more details on that in the report. One note on this, because everybody asks, on solarization and carbon credits. So basically shifting a diesel-powered water pump to solar power. So on average, so burning 370 liters of diesel generates about 1 carbon credit. So you could assume about 800 liters per day. The problem is it takes about, you need to produce about 50,000 liters of replace 50,000 liters of diesel a day in order to get credits from solarization. That's the equivalent to about 86 football fields of solar panels. So the issue isn't necessarily that you can't get carbon credits. It's just that the scale you need to do it is very large. So the path to carbon credits. So let's identify the opportunity here. So there are a lot of challenges in WASH. And this is an opportunity to link it to climate mitigation endeavors. There's a potential for revenue for either funding WASH projects themselves or at least continued operations and maintenance. We'll go through some key findings from the feasibility study, and we'll also kind of paint a hypothetical path forward if we were to take this project into the future. So about the project, the Amhara Windrock project, it's located in Amhara. It has about 50 to 100,000 beneficiaries in 10 sites. The goal was to solarize these 10 water systems, but also to reduce, and the carbon credits applied would be safe water, which would be reducing solid fuel use. The project would also improve the water quantity by increasing uptime and water quality through chlorination, and it hopefully provides sustained operation and maintenance for 10 plus years, which is the life of carbon credit project. A few of the features of it are the solarization was community financed, meaning the idea is that their monthly payment for financing the solar panels is actually less than what they're currently paying a month in fuel. Also note that you're only allowed to use 10% of fossil fuels for a water pump to apply a safe water project. It would also include on-site chlorine production and also inline water treatment, the system called Lara that's available in Ethiopia. And it also, that same system also includes remote monitoring. So the Godot decision framework, it's just a structured approach to help you all evaluate. It's available in the learning paper. Few notes on roles and responsibilities on a typical carbon project. So you have a project owner. So this is the entity that develops the project and manages the project. In this case, let's say it's Millennium Water Alliance. You have your local communities who are your key stakeholders. In the case of this project, it would be your local area government, the water user associations who would interact with more directly, and more indirectly would be the beneficiaries themselves. You have the verification bodies, which are independent auditors that verify the emissions. So you have third-party verifiers, but also the registries themselves. You also have donors and or investors. So these are the persons who provide the financial resources for the project. And finally, you have buyers. One note is a project developer could very well also be a project proponent or project owner, and vice versa. And same thing goes for donors and investors. So these can have some overlap. So building the foundation. So evaluating carbon opportunities. So things you take into consideration are your environmental impact, social benefits. Is it financially viable? Are you able to meet both local and international regulations? And we'll see how to apply these to the Lara project. Which everyone was able to talk about this, additionality, measurability, permanence. Additionality, again, in the case of Ethiopia, in the case of least developed countries and landlocked developed countries, it is assumed that your project would be additional, and this would apply to Ethiopia. So the decision framework. So does your project meet the key requirements for a carbon project? Can suppressed demand be justified and defended? Do the pros outweigh the cons? Is there a carbon developer that you would like to work with? And if so, it'd be worthwhile to move forward with a carbon credit project. So step one, evaluating a project viability. So a project should target between 30 and 50,000 households to ensure viability. You have to demonstrate that these people are relying on unsafe water and solid fuels. You also need to demonstrate non-detectable levels of E. coli. So it's basically pass-fail on this. So and this is measured at the household level, not at the source or tap level. And then basically you can only miss 10% of your samples to be able to get verified. And then again, on a particular system should be no more than 50,000 households, or else you might get into trouble with additionality. All the systems have to have unique IDs. In the case of this project, we would use something like M-Water, which lets you register both water sources and water points. You only be able to account for people who are within 1 kilometer of a water point. Our project focuses more on community water treatment, but in the case of household water treatment, technologies would need to meet a 2 to 3 star level according to the WHO. So if that's the case, feel free to move forward. Let's say can you justify and defend suppressed demand? So simply put, projects where you already have everybody's already boiling water, it's fair enough. You just kind of move forward and low risk. You don't have to say much. However, If your project has very low prevalence of actual people actually boiling water, you do have to make a very clear arguments and justifications. You have to be prepared to be able to speak to this, basically. And as I've noted, there are controversies that go with this, and I think we should all be able to be prepared to speak to it. You would make an equity argument for recognizing suppressed demand due to poverty and climate change. So weighing the pros and cons. So benefits include environmental impact, social benefits, economic incentives. I also note that this is results-based financing. So we're paying based on results. There's not a lot of opportunities. And one thing I'm learning, we're not necessarily even good at this yet. So how to doing result-based finance projects. So this is consider this also an opportunity to learn how this is done. Challenges, this is very complicated. Very complicated. It's a very complicated survey. I would say it's a Mary Poppins bag of information. I say it just keeps coming out. There's also financial viability, right? So you have to really make sure you're able to generate sufficient credits to cover your costs, the reputational risks, and again, regulatory uncertainties as laws and standards change. So do the pros outweigh the cons? You would look at the potential for revenue to sustain your projects. There's also another pro is quality monitoring data over time. I wish we could all collect data for a project after we've done it over 10 years. Also to get solid operations and maintenance data. This in itself, I believe, is valuable. And these also come with safeguards and feedback and mechanisms. Not that we already practiced this already, but this is also a requirement. Cons, revenue uncertainty, variability in the market, things change. We all work in settings that things can always change. It's resource intensive, it takes a lot of investment. Again, what we're talking about with navigating the certification process. Next, we move on to selecting a carbon developer, right? So you want to find someone with experience, not only in carbon credits and broadly, but specifically to safe water methodologies. Make sure they have decent technical expertise, and that it's someone you want to work with, and that the cost and financial terms you all are in agreement on. So you need to figure out, as part of working with a project developer, you would need to figure out basically who owns the credits, who registers them, what's the role of the developer in selling the credits, who has the exclusive rights to these credits, clarify whose roles and responsibilities are what. For example, somebody needs to go out and actually collect the monitoring data. Somebody actually needs to make sure the systems are operating, but somebody also has to, submit all the certifications and processes. Finally, there's also, determine how revenue sharing is done. So, assuming the project meets requirements, suppressed demand can be justified, pros outweigh the cons, and that the carbon project developer meets our expectations. Let's go ahead and move forward with this project. However, not so fast. One more thing, money. It's not free to implement these things. There's a lot of things you have to pay for, possibly infrastructure, treatment, the certification process, analysis, community engagement. You also have to do hygiene promotion usually, and then the human resources that are needed to make all this happen. So a few considerations for bridging these funding gaps are, so let me put it this way. So if you want to do a carbon credit project in an area that serves the poorest people in a rural area, usually not dense, it would usually very difficult to make your money back for the infrastructure from doing a carbon credit project. And a lot of this in like kind of investor money might go more towards somebody in a more peri-urban or populated area, someplace that's easy to access and monitor, or perhaps already has a better system set up for operations and maintenance. That said, so revenue from this, like the revenue you do get from this would at least need to be able to cover operations and maintenance of whatever project, along with the certification process. Also, the other thing, there's going to be expenses for the certification process and monitoring and everything before you see any revenue. So you will need to have some sort of funds to be able to cover that gap. A few considerations for funding and scale. So you could look at the layering carbon credit projects onto existing grant-funded projects as a way to cover your infrastructure costs. Also seek collaborative approaches, right? So seek, let's say you do a project, you will be able to, before you do anything, find somebody who's already doing a carbon credit project and see if they could actually include your project into theirs. The other one is vice versa, right? So if you say I'm doing 20 water, these 10 water systems, one of the first things we're going to do is go to see if there's any water systems that could also be incorporated into this project as well, in order to gain more scale. And funding could be a mix of grants, could be developer funding, which would be investment, so somebody's expecting to see a return. You could also be loans, even short-term loans for that 2-year period before you see any revenue, and a combination thereof. So moving forward with the Amhara project, so we launch it based on the feasibility study. In this case, let's say it's community finance solarization. We have a grant to support the chlorination and remote systems, and we are able to get a no interest loan for the startup and validation costs. I don't know who's giving out no interest loans, but be great. And then the goal is to provide a sustainable water access with basically just sufficient revenue to sustain operations and maintenance and the project itself. So now we move on to the certification journey. So now we're moving forward. We're going to get registered. The steps are, project documentation and stakeholder consultation, validation and registration, monitoring and reporting, verification and influence, and marketing and sale of carbon credits. So our first step in the credit process involves meticulous documentation where we outline our project blueprints, including its goals, expected environmental and social impacts, and the methodologies we'll employ to these outcomes. Equally important is our stakeholder consultation process. Here we engage with local communities alongside government entities and potential project partners to ensure that our projects meet our technical requirements, but it's also rooted in communities' needs and aspirations. The feasibility study included a baseline, a representative sample. We weren't able to go into the actual communities, which would have been a requirement, but we were able to use, we hadn't selected the communities yet by the time we were doing the baseline, but with that, that's also included in the learning paper. And we also conducted stakeholder consultations as part of the feasibility study as well. And those results are in there. This first step in the process takes about 6 to 12 months and costs between 30 and 50,000 for external costs. These are external costs along with staff time and any consultancy fees. So following our groundwork, we move into validation, where an accredited third party evaluates our project against stringent carbon standard criteria. This phase is crucial for ironing out any discrepancies and ensuring our project is on the right path towards sustainability compliance. This can last anywhere between 6 and 12 months and cost anywhere between $20,000 and $30,000. Again, these are external costs. So monitoring and reporting phase is where we continually gauge our project's performance, ensuring that we're not just meeting our targets, but also adapting and evolving. The data we collect here is pivotal and will feed into the reporting process. The reports encapsulate the project's achievements and learnings and are submitted for review, which is vital for informing our strategy moving forward. A few notes here on project data collection. So the kind of data you would need to collect include a baseline and ongoing household water quality data. And again, the water quality data is collected at the household level. Household usage and access, system functionality, and then in terms of the hygiene promotion, this may include developing educational campaigns, but also monitoring hygiene practice adoption rates, so household surveys to gauge people's hygiene practices. So in the verification phase, our project undergoes a vigorous audit to verify the accuracy of reported impacts, ensuring we're truly making a difference, and these steps reaffirm our commitment to integrity and accountability. With successful verification, we reach a pivotal moment, the issuance of carbon credits. And the duration of the verification and issuance can be between 6 and 12 months, and the cost between 15 and 30,000 USD. Finally, the final step is marketing and sale of our carbon credits. Here, you not only find buyers, but you would want to probably share a story of how these credits came to be and the fact that they are not just capturing methane, but they're actually providing people with safe drinking water. The revenue for this is crucial not only to sustain the project, but also for the ongoing maintenance. And the sales margins depend on this. It depends on anywhere from 10 to 50% of the revenue. It really depends on the amount of investment, if this person made an investment or not into the project, and any associated risks. So, process is project documentation and stakeholder consultation. So this is where you lay the groundwork and detailed planning and community engagement. Validation and registration, so gaining third-party approval, monitoring and reporting, verification and issuance, and marketing and sale of carbon credits. So a few reflections here. I'll mention that the project also examined reforestation for water, which has the potential to also get carbon credits. I'll add that the big key to this is scale. So making sure you basically have to work with others in a specific catchment area to be able to do this. I really do think it warrants more investigation. But there's an overview in the learning paper. And also one thing we didn't look at that could also be included is wetlands, which also have even more potential than just the reforestation itself. Risks, so market volatility, regulatory changes, data quality and verification. I think we've gone through a lot of these, but these are some of the key risks that you have to keep in mind. Recommendations, these are, I'll say, our objective recommendations. So, keep diversifying funding. This is a mitigation. This revenue comes from climate mitigation. And ideally, as WASH and water, we would also see revenue sometime for climate adaptation, which is something that water is getting very much impacted by climate change, and it'd be good to have funds dedicated specifically to adaptation. A robust data management. This is very important. If you mess up on your data, you're not going to get paid. Stay informed on changes in wherever it is you're working in your particular country, but also within the carbon standards and globally. Have transparent communication between yourself, between your partners, between each other as well. Carbon credits will succeed the best if we're all working towards this together and able to provide the most revenue for continued operations that we can. Now, these are my subjective recommendations. So feasibility, assess your projects early and assess them often. If you're doing a project, assess it to see if carbon credits are feasible, and include a developer early in the process if you can as well. Even during the proposal process, you can include a developer. Collaboration. So collaboration, like I was saying, working with others. This is a specialized set of skills. As much as we are good at building water points and designing and supporting systems to sustain water points more broadly, actually operating and maintaining a system is not something we go around doing. So having, collaboration allows for people to specialize in these specific things. I think of organizations like Fundifix and Uptime, who specifically work in operations and maintenance. And then finally, scale. Again, that comes off of the collaboration. So this helps reduce risks and cover these high fixed costs. So the more people you can, the more scale you can get, the more revenue you're able to get from this. And so next steps, I think we kind of covered a lot of this, but yeah, just explore carbon credit opportunities, connect with developers and donors and investors. Please consider WASH carbon credits. Resources will be available through the Millennium Water Alliance websites, and please do engage in those products. They offer much more detail than I was able to provide today. This is very much an overview. And now we'll move on to question and answer, right? So we'll move on to question and answer of both presentations. And we'll start off with people in the room. I don't know if you have any questions for Evan or I, and then we'll also have, I think we have a few questions online as well.
I have a generally very broad-based question. We're talking about very different sets of addressable markets. And in your own decarbonization water sort of report, one good example of that would be, let's say, the universe of water utility-based opportunity. Fundamentally, a very, very different opportunity relative to, let's say, the safe water opportunities that we typically target, I think, for most of the players in this room, in some of these overlooked, underserved communities in rural locations. So if we were to, let's say, focus on that latter group, I'm just curious, based on your vast experience over many years, it having come across, many different types of challenges and issues that have come up. And some of the major ones we've already touched on. And, at an operational level, 9 out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 of these project developers really have not dealt with the issue of how are they going to migrate the operating model from a community-focused approach eventually to something a little bit more professionally managed. I think everybody's struggling with that. And part of the problem nobody really knows in terms of the current legacy, if you will, system, what the real costs are. And you're talking about incremental costs being layered on top of that. And then there are many other similar sort of issues of that type. Everybody in this room is so aware of, the really critical importance of being able to migrate more towards a digital or digitized MRV sort of function and platform. And I think people are beginning to move that way with very sort of degrees of success and speed. And then if you were to combine that all together and you layer on top of that all these different, let's say, location-specific consideration, a market like Kenya has a real challenge in terms of, having to consider how to best deal with and absorb a potential 25% carbon levy. I mean, that's a really big bite right off the beginning. And then you have, the stacking and the bundling sort of strategy, which has worked really well with, let's say, blue carbon, right? Which was very, rightly or wrongly, was perceived to be very charismatic to begin with. And by the stacking, they were really able to maintain this really strong pricing premium today. If we were to try to apply that in sort of the safe water context, there are very logical interventions that tie into a given target community, whether it's ICS, whether it is gender equity, in addition to save water, right? And everybody has tried, but so far it really has not elicited the type of buy-side sort of endorsement, right? And feedback and price discovery. Maybe it's not being done at a scale that would bring these guys into the picture, but I mean, so this is sort of like a laundry list just to illustrate, I think, what all of us, I'm sure, would agree and sort of sign off on, which is you've got a lot of moving targets here. So if we were to look at the big picture, based on your experience and sort of Jason's as well in actually dealing with these line projects, do you see sort of a logical way to break these down so we don't try to cover all of these moving, sort of targets all at once, but address some in the context of compartmentalizing these?
Yeah, I think there's a lot wrapped up in there. There are a couple of key threads though that tie together a few of your points. So one of the first ones is, and we kind of buried the lead with this, the big advantage of carbon credits is its performance-based funding to deliver a service, which, as you pointed out, is something that WASH has been trying to move towards for a while. Is not really fully there. Even some of the most successful organizations haven't fully cracked the nut. We are not service-oriented in most cases. We're still CapEx and project-oriented. So are the major donors, including USAID. The idea here, the reason we thought this was a good idea 16 years ago, and it's still a good idea now, is that it's a payment to deliver a service, not a payment to deliver a product or a piece of infrastructure. So that's why bother, right? It's an incentive to move in that service orientation direction. A lot of the other points you brought up can boil down to scale, and scale in different forms. So one is, do you have existing scale projects? One of our new partners, East Congo Initiative, is already delivering water to 200,000 people in East Congo. They've already made those investments. Now there's an opportunity to bring in carbon on top of it to help maintain those systems. But they've already done the hard work of having a large scale program. Jason said a minimum of 20 to 50,000 households. That's 200,000 people or so. You really do need to be operating on that scale just to cover the transaction costs. And that's just on a project level. Another thing is, where are you working? We've ended up working in Northern Kenya because it's a program the Millennium Water Alliance runs and operates, and it's an area of great need, but it's not where you would go if you're doing this on a purely like optimized cost and revenue from carbon credits. That project's gonna be really, really hard. There's other places where it works easier. It doesn't work everywhere, but there's still plenty of people that do not have a safe drinking water service today that could be provided with one via financially sustainable carbon revenue. Then the third point on scale is aggregation. Each of you are running organizations that have donors, right? And we have donors that supported these reports, supported Jason's reports. So you might be able to go to your donors and ask them to buy your credits, but you're probably taking the same money that you would be getting in a grant form anyway, right? So it might just be a kind of a gimmick or like a new shiny object for the donor. There's other money out there that grows the pie. Industry needs these credits, wants these credits. That's not money you're accessing already as the WASH community. But to go get that, it's really hard for Keith to do that separately from Kelly, separately from Laura, right? Separately from Courtney. You don't have that Rolodex. You're not talking, you don't staff. Bottom line, you don't staff that. Mm-hmm. So a vision that's worked elsewhere, you already said this for blue carbon, it's worked in REX as well, it's worked in other places, is aggregation, where we can generate credits for a variety of projects and pool them and ideally increase the value of that pooled credit rather than decreasing it, and then have some efficiencies of, again, scale with marketing.
Yeah, I think the point though is also absent some heroic assumption in terms of what you would see as a forward carbon price curve, right? Assuming fairly conservative numbers. At the end of the day, it's very clear, no matter how you aggregate, no matter sort of how much you bundle different interventions into a given program, the economics just simply do not work out, and you end up having to bifurcate your financeable or non-financeable cash flow stream for the project into one that we will require the traditional permanent capital, which is the philanthropy, the grants and so forth, and then you would then have a residual sort of cash flow stream that is financeable, that is investable. But right now, that's, and if you do, like, let's say for some of these legacy community model driven sort of cash flows, that is usually, you know, you on a best case basis, you might be able to get it up to 50–60% of covering all of the external financing requirements. Well, you know, which is not a small number, but it clearly is not 100 and it's not over 100. So I think for us, is, you know, the challenge, at least let's say for our firm, would be saying, look, strategically, how do we position this over the next 1, 2, 3 years in terms of what we assume, right? Do we keep on trying to optimize this mix by maximizing to the fullest extent possible the financeable cash flow stream, and eventually over time reducing the non-investable, non-financeable stream, so that you improve and optimize your funding mix, you know, which in and of itself would be a great achievement. But the question then becomes, what, you know, where do you go from there, right? Unless we assume some really heroic carbon prices, you know, over the next 5 years, this is not going to move fundamentally. And the only thing that we see you might be able to sort of turbocharge, you know, these numbers a little bit might be to continue trying to layer on top the stacking. And more importantly, you know, assuming that you might be able to persuade the buy side to recognize independently these standalone incremental values. I'm just curious in terms of whether you've come across folks that have tried to go down that route.
Yeah. So there's a lot, again, a lot built into there. Just a few, I agree with everything you said. There are some nuances that to calibrate some of that. You know, heroic pricings on credits, not usually a risk the wash world wants to take, right? However, there are plenty industry players out there that are betting on heroic prices, right? Prices going $100. You don't necessarily have to assume on that. There are contracts out there for advanced purchases or guaranteed on delivery purchases that are well above market. We've pre-sold the credits from our programs at $40 a credit. So we're able to use that money now at $40, even though the market's at $10 or $15, because they're buying the charismatic value of the program. So you don't necessarily have to gamble on prices going up. You know, a project.
Would you not agree that in a lot of cases, these are relatively sort of proprietary sort of arrangements where?
Well, that's right. It's that bilateral relationship, which is still a challenge.
Price, you know, when you get to really big, large volumes, right?
It depends. I mean, there are some really big buyers out there. Oh, yeah. Microsoft is paying $1,000 for a direct air capture credit right now, and they can't buy enough to meet their demand, right? So someone is influencing them. Bill Gates is, but there's, you know, it's a big issue, right? Obviously, there's a downside risk here that the VCM goes away entirely. There's an upside opportunity that it does go to $40 or $50 or $100. In between those things is elbow grease to find the right buyer at the right volumes, as you're suggesting. The other thing I want to point out, though, is as WASH, I don't think that it is necessarily it's not a failure to be mixing CapEx paid by donors with OpEx paid by carbon. That's a huge win in a sector that has failed to maintain services for as long as we've been around so far, right? That's a breakthrough. 100% failure, right? Yeah. So you know, it is a big breakthrough if we even for 20 years we can get carbon to pay for OpEx. The other quick point I'd be interested in, and especially what Laura has to say about this when we get to the panel in a minute, is one challenge that also exists. I think it closely relates to that question of, are you finding the right addressable project and demographic with the right technology? You know, again, still need people drinking unclean water, but water filters at schools in Rwanda that's very, very dense where there's lots of water, it is cheaper. Our project is financially viable only on carbon credits. The program in Northern Kenya is not. So that's a question. And a related question to that is mission and focus. An NGO may or may not be well placed to really do what it takes to optimize getting this revenue. And then they can walk away with a bad taste in their mouth that it wasn't worth the time, right? That's another risk. Whereas companies or social enterprises might be able to address where it is financially viable and run a business.
Circle.
Yeah.
You introduce yourself real quick.
Vikas Pandey from Windrock International.
Oh, yeah.
Quick question, just in terms of sort of the volume of credits that you're talking about. When you say it takes roughly 200,000 households for this to be worthwhile, can given suppressed demand, you know, I mean, is there a range of carbon credits you expect from 200,000? How much would that be?
So rule of thumb is about 0.1 to 0.2 carbon credits per person per year. And there's quite a few variables that go into that. But, you know, 10 people is 1 carbon credit. There are quite a few variables, though. To give you an example, how much water, you know, what's the fraction of water that really was boiled versus treated in other methods in the baseline? What kind of stoves were being used and what are the efficiency of those stoves? How much water are people actually consuming? Are you treating water in an institutional level and a household level? Another big factor is called non-renewable biomass, the fraction of wood fuel use in a country that is considered non-renewable. It's highly variable. And all of these variables can each have like a 2 to 4x impact up or down on your credit potential.
And to plug the learning paper, it does break these different factors down.
Right, but doesn't the suppressed demand avoid having to do all those?
All those other things I mentioned, you have to measure.
You do have to.
Yeah, the odd thing about suppressed demand, again, it's a legal fiction. It's like the idea that the queen owns all the swans, right? Like, don't overstudy it because it's not supposed to be logical. It exists for a political reason. Within the methodology, you can only credit people that either did boil their water or would have boiled their water with another barrier, which is represented as the fraction of people. It's essentially a breakdown of the ratios of baseline water treatment. So if you're in a community where 80% of people chlorinate already, they do not have suppressed demand. By the way, suppressed demand is demand for energy suppressed by poverty. That's what it means. So if people are treating their water already with something like chlorine, you're not getting credit for those people.
So do you still have to sample what percentage of the community is boiling water?
At the baseline, but only in terms of extrapolating it to the number of people who are not doing any treatment method at all. So if 20% of people boil their water and, oh God, I'm going to do this math right now. And 10% of people use chlorine and 70% of people don't do anything at all, you can get credits for 2/3 of everybody. 2/3 of the entire population. You can extrapolate that 10 and 20% ratio to the 70%. And your carbon credit, you're treating water for everybody, but you're getting credits for that 70% of people that either are or would have been boiling. Don't overthink it.
So since Jason's talking about our project in Ethiopia, let me give you an actual example. So people supposedly are already chlorinating water, but because they're using diesel to pump the water and diesel is not available or diesel is not affordable, the water doesn't get pumped. So the solar water pump increases the reliability of pumping. The reliable water pumping is the only way to get reliable chlorination. So what is it that we can count in this?
Yeah, so chlorination, if it's your intervention, is qualifiable. Evidence Action and IPA are using their chlorine dispensers and they're getting carbon credits from chlorine. So you are able to credit chlorine if that's your project. You're
Our
also
project is the solar water.
Yeah, you can also credit that, although as you're aware, those numbers don't add up.
Yeah, and this they increased uptime through the solarization, right? So if you're only able to pump 4 hours a day with diesel, that increased uptime that you were able to provide, you're able to claim credits for that. Also, even though they did chlorinate the water quality itself was not there. Like they're doing batch chlorination, but it was not at considered safe water. So you're able to, even if they are chlorinating, if it's not safe, then you're able to. If you make it safe, then you can claim that.
That's right. So yeah, that's right. If there's already a service, but it's a bad service and you can demonstrate that, then you can improve on it. You also have to test, Jason did mention this, but it's worth repeating. You have to test water quality, microbial contamination at the point of collection and the point of use. You have to follow people to their households, and you're only getting, you're treating water for 100 people, but in a random sample, 2 of 10 have contamination in a jerry can, you're only getting credit for 80%. So these haircuts can come at you left and right, all of which is solved when somebody pays like $100 for a carbon credit.
Are there user fees in any of this?
There can be. you don't, that nothing precludes that and nothing requires it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like that is a role to play.
Yeah,
So not beyond what the consumers can afford to pay and willingness to pay, et cetera.
because you don't have to demonstrate financial additionality, the registries and the auditors do not look into your books.
I
How you
think
deliver
the
the service.
sustainability of the project.
Right.
Addressing some fundamental consumer payment of water seems to have a role to play here.
And it would be consistent with moving in the direction of a service that would still recognize that everybody in this room drinks subsidized water as it is. So, you know, moving away from the idea that we should have full cost recovery from people in these places. I live in Boulder. I pay 40% of the cost of my water delivery, right? You guys do too here. Yeah.
And I'll add that achievement operations isn't the issue, maintenance is. So it's one thing to have, they usually are able to sustain their daily operations, pay their staff and everything. It's when something breaks down, it's when it's time to replace something that real issues happen. I want to move on to the panel discussion.
Includes you, so you can say it in your.
Yeah. But I want to move on to the panel discussion, but we'll try to keep the panel discussion at a reasonable time. At any time left over, we will continue for questions, and I can even stay over and.
John, yeah.
So the 2 billion, how, is that annual?
Yeah, the market size is $2 billion a year right now.
How much is being drawn down from the 2 billion right now?
What do you mean?
How much is
The water?
unused? Of the 2
Oh, so that's retirement. So that's people buying credits and retiring. That's transactions.
Okay, but what is the actual amount of money that's available?
That's it.
That's it. So it's
Yeah.
all being used right now.
Yeah, that, I mean, again, it's industry buyers, right? It's not very transparent. Like, you gotta dig into this. There's no market exactly. The demand, right? Last year's supply was a bit ahead of demand, but generally demand has been ahead of supply and still expected to be ahead of supply. So there is an opportunity to put more supply into the marketplace. That's where we are all sitting, right? The supply side. I lost my train of thought. There's another piece of that there. Anyway.
Is the expectation with increased supply, prices wouldn't fall, prices would maintain.
Yeah, or go up. So that's right. So thanks, David. So 2 other points there. The vast majority of that 2 billion market is RED Plus projects, which is like 80 or it's over 80% right now. There's a need for diversification. So when we're talking about average price, it's an average price where 80% of that mix is forestry preservation that has kind of become unpopular recently. And so projects like ours, projects like these are different and are entering into a marketplace that's dominated by a project type that isn't very charismatic right now. The other thing is there are a lot of commitments that have already been made. The reason that Bloomberg and everybody else is able to forecast that demand question is because those are based on existing commitments that come due in 2030. Everybody made these 2030 commitments starting back in 2015, and they haven't necessarily paid for them yet, right? Present value of money. So there's a huge demand for credits that's already committed, and the supply is not meeting it. So a lot of these companies are going to have to pay a higher price in a couple of years. But again, a WASH NGO doesn't want to take that risk, right? A project developer might take that risk.
Let's shift to the
Yeah,
panel.
panel.
While the panel comes up, let me just introduce who we have. So we have 2 online, Nabil Chemaly with the Conrad N Hilton Foundation. He's the Senior Program Officer for Safe Water. Also online, we have Lars Osterwalder, who's joining us, I believe, from Addis, very late. Sorry, Lars. Who's been working with us on this study and has a lot of experience in East Africa and carbon credits. In person, we have David Spira joining us from Deloitte, leveraging 25 years of experience in international development, clean energy, because I'm reading them.
And watch, yeah, me too. Really great to have your expertise on this, David. Lara Lambert, the Senior Director of Program Design at Water Mission, bringing us some practical hard-won wins in Tanzania with work that they've been doing and beyond. And Kelly Parsons, WaterAid. Thanks for sharing your experiences with us. Evan will moderate.
So thanks everybody again for being here today, and Neil and Lars, thanks for being online. You know, we're talking a lot about supply, but I'd actually like to talk a bit more about demand for these questions of who's going to buy these credits and at what price. David, you and I published an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning, or yesterday morning, on this topic combined with who's buying water-related credits and corporate demand and corporate water risk footprint. Could you maybe talk a bit more about what the corporation side of this is, the demand side for water credits?
Yeah, I did just, and thanks, and we did just recently publish a paper on this, and I think, I don't have the specifics in front of me, but demand is growing. The corporations are, they're insisting on supporting this market, and they're insisting their own stakeholders, their customer, their buyers, their shareholders, their stakeholders, the communities in which they operate. You mentioned social license, I think earlier. A lot of, this is the real fundamental source of demand, and I think it's only expected to increase.
One of the other things we identified in this paper was that one challenge is that corporations often want water in settings. So they want it inside their supply chain, which is not necessarily where all these projects are, but that's another thing to navigate. Lara, you were also, I think, had an urgent question, so feel free to take it away there. But with Water Mission, you guys are already running a large scale program using carbon. Can you talk about that program and your experience with it?
Yeah, so just for overview, the project that we've developed and we're implementing right now is in Tanzania. So Water Mission, we implement, we're working in 9 countries globally, but this project specifically looking at safe water infrastructure development, safe water distribution, safe water treatment, supply, all the way to schools, clinics, and households. And so we decided to pilot a carbon credit program about 2 years ago, where we started in about 7 communities with 7 safe water schemes and have now expanded to 11 communities, serving roughly just under 100,000 people through that project.
What's been the experience? Carbon credits, good or bad?
What I wanted to say was, we were talking about some of the biggest challenges that we faced in terms of, being successful in this project. And one of the things I thought, if we had seen Jason's go or no go diagram, we would have said no. I'm glad we didn't have that. And so I think for us, it's a positive experience because I think one of the things that with Water Mission, and maybe it's because we're an engineering organization, we're not scared of the opportunity to fail, and so there was this no fear of failure. That comes from, we had seed money that gave us that luxury to not be concerned with that. So that allowed our team to be creative, it allowed them to be innovative in how we implemented this project. It also helped color those conversations that we had with our partners, with our corporate partners, in terms of understanding the true viability of this project. And so I would say positive experience, but a significant learning curve.
Do you guys have buyers, or do you have to find your own buyers?
So the reason Water Mission started with this was because it was our corporate partners that really had this interest in investing in climate-friendly investment, right? And so if you look at donations, in contrast, climate financing allowed them to invest in something that will help them reach either their ESG goals or their net zero goals. And so it was interest from our corporate partners that really led Water Mission to pursue this initially. And so we do have potential buyers lined up, and something that we're looking at for the next 5, 10, 15 years is how do we ensure that we have either maybe some of those advanced contracts or just creating that supply to that demand that's there.
So Kelly, WaterAid UK and the Resilient Water Accelerator were sponsors of this report. There's interest in the WaterAid family in how the voluntary carbon market connects to water. How are you thinking about it as WaterAid US?
Yeah, thank you. I think as a federation, we're approaching it with interest, curiosity, and potentially caution. I think that we're so glad to see, and I think we've all heard the shift in the sector at World Water Week and UN Water talking about finance. We all recognize the importance of finance, and I think WaterAid has been on that for a long time now. I think we are really good at talking amongst ourselves about finance and really bad at talking to financiers about finance. So I think that this is an opportunity, a way into a carbon market and a green climate fund, frankly, that could really change the game. I think the mitigation adaptation point that Jason raised is really interesting, but it completely aligns with WaterAid's strategy in terms of private sector and private sector engagement. And that means both development of private sector utilities domestically, as well as the engagement of corporates. And we've had some demand from our corporate partners to do similar programs like this. I think we totally agree it's a source of private finance that's critical. How are we going to go after it? And there's huge challenges, but I think we need to learn and continue to capture. And even if it is on the margin, 10% on the margin, especially on the OpEx, can make a huge difference in sustainability of our projects long term. I do think it's a critical question as to whether the NGO retains it, the community retains it. What's the localization and the power dynamic going on there once these credits are generated? I think the triple bottom line that you talk about in the report is fantastic. The potential with health, climate, resilience, all coming forward. And then I'm really excited because credits require data and integrity. And frankly, I think it's a space where the sector has fallen short, right? And so the technology that will come to bear, we lose so much water without knowing where it's going through all these different systems. We have breakdowns, you know, our performance is horrible in many places around the world. And so this will bring additionality in a different sense to our own sector, which is much better organizational governance, much stronger data integrity and decision making.
I want to come back to that question of community and especially marginalized communities and gender equity in a second, as requested. But before we get there, Nabil is on the line from the Hilton Foundation. I hope you can hear me. Nabil, you are a donor. You represent a donor. You supported and sponsored this report, the NWA report. So why? What's your interest in carbon, and where do you think there might be a potential around carbon credits and WASH programming?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Can you hear me?
We can. It's a little soft, which we're going to try to solve in the room here. Hold on.
Yeah, I can hear you very well. I don't know if you can hear me.
Just give us 1 second here.
Where'd the box go?
No, it's.
Okay, there you go, Nabil. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So just from our perspective related to this work, the feasibility study that Jason presented, I just want to highlight a few points. First, in our safe water strategy at the Hilton Foundation, we recognize that we need to do more in this area because we cannot ignore all the climate challenges that we have, especially that we're working in the water sector. Now, in your presentation, Evan, you rightly said that the carbon market, the WASH community doesn't know a lot about the carbon market. And I think that this statement is applicable to us because we need to learn more about that, and this is why we decided to invest in this feasibility because we need to see how we can do this better, how we can integrate this better in our work, and how we can elevate all these climate challenges and address them in our work and see where the opportunities are. Now, having said that, I want to highlight that the Hilton Foundation is interested in the learning and looking at the feasibility. So we are pretty much looking at sustaining water services, water provision to citizens, and we see a potential to generate an additional revenue to cover the gap in O&M cost recovery. And this is what we're exploring here. However, we are not considering investing in the carbon market. So it's just feasibility, learning, and not investment. I don't know if you can hear me or not. I see that. Okay. Oh, great. So you can hear me. And the second point I wanted to also quickly mention is related to verification. I think that what we learned from different colleagues and organizations we work with is that a big challenge is to really verify that a project qualifies for carbon credits and how this is calculated. And this is something where we are really looking more into this and trying to see what we can learn and how we can get more information on that, because we understand this is a challenge, but we're interested in learning more about that. So over.
Thanks, Nabil. And then Lars, you played a big role in the MWA report. Are there any other observations that we didn't cover today so far that you want to highlight to this audience?
Yeah, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I think what I would like to say is that carbon credits are not the silver bullet that will solve all our problems. And I think also when we talk about climate finance, I think we need to look more broadly than just at carbon credits. Yeah, carbon credits is one possible revenue stream, but there is climate funds and others out there that's probably also worth exploring. And yeah, just generally to get better in understanding the carbon footprints in projects, how those can be reduced. That can be the use of renewable energy and others, and that all whether or not we're getting carbon credits for it. And then still, of course, carbon credits can and will play a role in certain settings for certain project types in certain countries. And generally, it's projects that can be scaled, that can be replicated, I think more than scaled, reach tens of thousands of households again and again. I mean, we had some nice examples like water treatment at schools. If you can show that works, yeah, in one district, all the schools get water treatment, you can scale that, go to the next district, just do the same thing again, over and over again, or the chlorine dispensers, or for container-based sanitation, a business expanding into new towns. I think that's the project types that are really made for carbon credits. If you have a carbon benefit and can just repeat and put in the same efforts and the same strategy again in new places. Maybe just briefly, just as my few words about suppressed demand. Overall, I guess we should look where we really have real emission reductions. And I feel we, as a sector, should put more efforts into sanitation, where we have methane emissions, and to better understand how we can reduce emissions from pits and septic tanks, mainly from on-site sanitation. Container-based sanitation has emission reductions, but how frequently would we need to empty other latrines? Or what could we do? Could we add something to the latrines to reduce methane, where we then really have real emission reductions? For the water projects, it really depends on the country. I would just recommend to go beyond what is allowed on paper. Because a journalist, the general public, doesn't care that much about what is written somewhere. Yeah, if a busy journalist comes, doesn't like your organization, maybe, or for whatever reason doesn't like carbon credits, if you have one person in 100 boiling in the baseline scenario, and you still claim carbon credits for 99% because no one is doing anything else, that can be a significant reputational risk, and possible then also that the carbon standards would adopt to that and change the rules while you are implementing. And they say, okay, now we change from 99 to 1%. And after that, the project or the carbon registration, the carbon revenue won't come anymore as expected. Anyway, just a few additions from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars. Those are all very important. I think to expand on a couple of points Lars mentioned, we've been talking about carbon credits here because that's what we were supposed to talk about. Climate finance is much, much bigger. In 2023, over $3 billion was directed to the water and wastewater sector in low and middle income countries by multinational banks. And 900 million of that was to LDCs. So the entire carbon market is $2 billion, but multilateral finance to low and middle income countries is $3 billion into water. So perhaps we shouldn't be talking about carbon credits at all. We should figure out how to access that multilateral money more overtly. So as a point Lars said, another point, we've been talking a lot about water because that's where there has been a methodology and there are programs, but methane mitigation from latrines and open defecation is a much bigger addressable opportunity that's under addressed today. Yeah. And then another point he mentioned at the end there, the registries can change methodology at any time. Not a law, it's just another nonprofit making up rules as they go along. So that can be challenging to count on. All right.
I was just going to add, I think, for those of you that are doing, wash or water supply, I think this is work that we're already doing, right? And so one of the things that when we made that decision to pursue carbon was, we thought, well, we're already doing this work. Why don't we try to collect the data and monitor those key things that would allow us to get that funding for work that we're already doing, right? And so it was money essentially that we felt like was just left on the table, that if we just would be more intentional in terms of monitoring and reporting on that data, that we could generate or at least tap into different financing. And so when we started, even at Water Mission, our projects, we obviously looked at SDG 13, we looked at 7, and we picked 2 on the social side that we felt like we could, be able to prove that additionality. But now that we're 2 years in, we've added, I think, another 4 SDGs that we've learned through this process that we're actually creating that additionality too. And I think that we weren't even aware of, or at least we weren't monitoring or capturing that or measuring that in any way. And so that's allowed us now in this next phase to increase our SDGs from 4 to 8 essentially, and be able to get funding that we wouldn't have been able to get before if we weren't monitoring that or measuring that. So I think if you're doing the work and you're providing safe water, at the household level, and you can prove the safety of that water, and you're using clean energy, then consider those ways that you can include carbon in your monitoring frameworks.
There's on this stacking of benefits, there's a few pieces here that speak to something that was mentioned earlier. One is these stacked benefits. So it starts as a carbon credit, and as a water benefit, it might have all these other SDG, quantifiable benefits or qualifiable benefits. You can stack those so that you can get a higher price on your credit. You can also separate them and sell them separately. That's also been done successfully. The one thing that has been tried that has not been successful is to create a water credit by itself. Sure, there's a few people itching in the room to come up with that idea. It's been come up with before. The gold standard even has a water benefit credit that nobody has used in 10 years because there is no explicit market for that. There is a market for carbon credit. David, I wanted to give you just a chance to comment on your guys' focus on the report around methane and the energy transition. If there's burning additions you wanted to share.
Oh, thank you. I think Lars said it very well about the methane being under-addressed, and also the key question being, and the key focus being on-site sanitation, and the question being, how frequently do you have to empty the pits to make a difference? I think the leading person on this is Barbara Evans at Leeds University, and she's working on an answer to that question. I'll wait to find out what it is. I also take the point about professionalization, and I was glad to hear what you said about private sector, and because I think there's a lot, because I agree with your point that it's not enough. You're not going to finance a lot of projects just off carbon credits, but if we can do things like get for example, what Filou in Senegal is trying to do, it run rural water concessions with water vending, solar-powered water vending machines. And you get a revenue stream from selling the water. You get massively good data because you're getting the water which they're getting, and you can get carbon credits for it. And then you're starting to talk about a real business model, I think, one that can scale without government finance, without philanthropic finance, which is good because there's much more private capital than there is government or philanthropic capital in the world. So that's what I'd like to add.
Thanks, David. On the methane, I noticed a question earlier in the chat, maybe an hour ago now, but the question was, does the methane estimates, does that qualify things like decomposition in reservoirs or rivers? It actually doesn't. So these numbers that we estimate in our report are very, very, very low. They're only just around centralized treatment or known locations where there is no centralized sewage treatment. But all of the organic decomposition producing methane in rivers and reservoirs around the world is not quantified in this. And there's also another huge mitigation opportunity. David, I wanted to go back to you. You have your consultancy, you're not a nonprofit, and you are building a line of business in the energy transition. And where do you see perhaps climate finance more broadly, if it gives you more latitude on your response, fitting into water?
Well, what we heard earlier, I support. I think as another revenue stream for, not for Deloitte, of course, but for these small scale water projects that are struggling to have cost recovery from capex, from opex and maintenance, struggling to be developed in sort of the pace and scale that they need to be. So they don't have adequate public sector finance. I think carbon finance and carbon credits in water and climate finance more broadly are really, could be I don't say a drop in the bucket, but actually a very important source of incremental funding that can accelerate the transition to the type of complete water treatment that we're looking for, a complete the water sanitation that we're looking for. So I'm looking for opportunities in the countries that we support on our the USAID funded projects that we're involved in, to try to integrate climate finance where that's possible, and do so through irrigation and scaling. Look, it's not in the large cities and large municipalities, but it's in the small towns and communities where there's a lot of potential replicable solutions. And I think aggregation and the new technologies that support not only are right technologies for delivering the service, but also can offer some MRD support and do that remotely and cost effectively. Anyway, I'm very much leaning into the opportunity, and I want my colleagues to do so as well.
So you talked about scale, we talked about that repeatedly today, and aggregation, and also the tight margins on these projects. So, Cal, I'm going to give you the last word on this. How does that all then relate to empowering communities and some of the most marginalized, underserved communities, and especially questions around even gender empowerment with water access? How do we balance those imperatives against, perhaps the more, bureaucratic process of trying to get a carbon credit topper?
Yeah, I think, and I love the word topper. We've launched a program in Madagascar called H2O for CO2. It's looking to bring clean, safely managed water to about 500,000 people. I think it's estimated to bring 240,000 tons of CO2 annually. Our challenges are it's seed funding. We need upfront. We need the carbon registration activities, right? That has to be paid for. And then the longer term finding a buyer. And so this has got to be part of a blended finance play. And I think we need to see it as such, right? It's one piece, it's not the whole thing. I think that relates back to communities in a way that enables them to, or us to offload some of the risk that traditionally we've gone in and developed a well and then departed, leaving them with the OPEX or the operating risk, and thinking that governments are going to step in also. And so it can be very empowering to a community. I think when it comes to gender, it needs to not be a side issue, but it needs to be a core outcome of any credits, whether carbon or otherwise. If we can get a water credit going, let's go. It should have a core gender element to it. But I think that these are really ways of lifting up the communities that we're with, maybe that are so detached from markets. And so we can be intermediaries, but there's financial institutions out there that I think are ready and willing to jump in and be those intermediaries as well. It will take some innovation, but if there's a supply demand disconnect, that's right for a new market player to come in and fix it, right? I look forward to that.
We have maybe 1 minute left for any questions or contributions from the audience, please.
Yeah, I'm Jenna from CARE, and I just want to pick up on that gender point, because when we saw, this is a few years ago now, was we've done a bunch of solarization in water systems, and the minute they started monetizing, we've done it in a very gender equal way, right? And actually like putting women as the people who were controlling the solar pumps, all of that. The minute they started monetizing, women got pushed out, men took over the businesses, men started running them like 9 to 5 businesses and shut off the pumps. At the time, the women needed water because men were thinking on an entrepreneur business schedule. Like women are like, I gotta get water at 5 in the morning, 8 o'clock at night. How do we balance that space of the minute something is seen as being profitable and business oriented, often women get crowded out of that space. So in this kind of a blended finance, how can we start addressing?
I think that takes the community change that we all know has to happen at the very grassroots level. I think it takes training and empowerment of women. Women in community water boards has been a huge success in our sector, and I think has changed the way in which WASH can lead to fantastic gender outcomes when done correctly. So I think having that core to any program that we're coming forward with, whether it's about carbon credits or not, has to be baseline in any approach.
And my assumption would be from the conversation today, and even if we think about the dynamics in the room, if I can just name it, the carbon credit conversation drives then this very finance, not as many women in the room conversation. What can we be doing now to push the carbon credit conversation to build on that stuff we already know at the community level?
I would turn it back to you. I think your organization does a fantastic breadth of work. I think financial training of women is core, and we know that. And so it also opens up new types of donors for all of us. We're all out there trying to find the right funding for the right things. And I think new types of investors also. Women will inherit more money in this next generation than ever before in the history of the world. And so we'll start controlling more, and we'll hope that through us and the changes we can help accelerate will play out in communities all around the world as well.
That's the last word.
Yep. Okay, we're done. I mean, obviously, this is the start of the conversation. I mean, this was meant to introduce some new studies and resources, but also connect many of us who are interested in figuring this out more. So if you don't leave knowing everything you wanted to learn today, that was probably expected, but to be continued. And as Jason mentioned, these resources are available at UC Boulder's website and on the MWA website. Thanks to our panel for bringing your expertise and experience.
I want to thank everybody who joined online here, and we're closing up. And please do reach out with any questions. You could email us. We'll be sharing this information as well. I'm also trying to get a chat bot going for this. I'm testing it now. Hopefully it can answer your questions. Well, thank you very much.